All right, guys, welcome back to my kitchen. Today we're going to finish out Unit 3 and talk about desegregation and affirmative action. So hopefully you've taken care of your UNC Supreme Court case that took place a couple years ago, the Google Doc, and the video that you had to watch. So it's kind of an introduction to our topic for today and kind of see where affirmative action stands right now. And obviously at the end, we're going to come back and talk about some current events that are going on with a similar topic. So this is not something that is no longer debated. This is still obviously really heavily debated in the private, but also in the public sector working for the government. So, all right, so we're going to kind of get into a little bit of the history of segregation. Obviously, like I said before at the beginning of this unit, when you guys get to APUSH next year, you get into a lot more detail about the civil rights movement. In this class, we're just kind of hitting the surface and getting some of the key events and the key Supreme Court cases. So we're going to start today with a really old Supreme Court case. No, Heimler, we don't want to hear you right now. A really old Supreme Court case. This comes to us from 1896. So this is Plessy versus Ferguson. And what this sets up is legalized segregation for the next 60 or so years, okay? And so essentially what that Supreme Court case says is that there could be separate facilities for the different races as long as they were equal facilities. Now, obviously, we know that the facilities were not equal, and it was kind of like the government just turned a blind eye to that for a long time until the 1950s. And actually, this case that you're going to see here about Heimler, or from Heimler, after the notes is about that Supreme Court case. So that's kind of your final required Supreme Court case from this unit. So on Canvas, you'll watch that video. It's a little 3-minute video. You probably already know the details of the case and everything, but that's the case that ends school segregation. So obviously super impactful. So you'll come back to that at the end. All right. So again, from the last class, we talked about this. Basically, all of the civil rights issues deal with what amendment? And I'm going to assume that you all said the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. So we talk about the 14th Amendment a lot in this unit. We talked about it with selective incorporation as well. And so it's just this kind of idea where everyone, regardless of where they live or who they are, what their background is, what their demographics are, should have the same protections from the government. And again, we're kind of at this point where we're constantly balancing and trying to figure out, okay, so 14th Amendment or 10th Amendment or, a different amendment, how are they going to balance this stuff out? And this is, the country's in growing pains like it's been for, since the beginning. And just trying to figure out exactly what that right balance is between equal protection, but also allowing states some autonomy and protecting everyone's rights. And, sometimes the government doesn't really know exactly how to do that. And, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, you could feel like, well, this is a really good decision or this is a really bad decision. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about schools and how schools were kind of initially desegregated. Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools, they took a long time. So that Supreme Court case that you're going to come back to at the end took place in 1954. And it ended, at least in theory, segregation in public schools. And so essentially what happened, though, is that a lot of the schools dragged their feet. Like, for example, Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools didn't really integrate until the early 1970s. And so a lot of districts just really dragged their feet on this. So they came up with solutions that were half solutions. So the first thing that a lot of districts did in the South, especially urban districts, was freedom of choice, kind of like what we've got now in Forsyth County. Parents can choose to send their kids to different schools, but they have to provide transportation. Now, obviously, if you're living in poverty, especially like a lot of minorities were when this first happened, the opportunity to actually take your kids to a school that was a historically white school was probably pretty unlikely. So this was a way for the districts to say, yes, we're moving towards desegregation, so they could get the courts off their backs, but not really actually fully do it. And so that's what a lot of districts in the South did, at least initially. And then actually there was a Supreme Court case we'll talk about here in a second that dealt with Charlotte schools. And essentially what happened is they said that the districts that have allowed for freedom of choice in the past, that's not good enough. That's not desegregating the schools quickly enough. And so they are then going to start forcing districts to bus kids across kind of like racial boundaries. So a lot of the cities obviously were geographically segregated, and you'll get a little bit into that next year when we talk about redlining and stuff like that. That happened in a lot of urban districts and cities in the South, especially during this time period. And so to be able to like actually desegregate the schools, you had to take kids from over here and send them to school over there, and you had to take kids from over here. And so just basically you had to bus the kids across the district to make sure that the schools were integrated. So here in Forsyth County schools, it's kind of crazy. One of the teachers that used to teach at Reagan, she retired after teaching for 50 years. Goodness gracious. She was in school, let's see, I'm trying to think here. So was she, man, she may have been teaching at that point. Goodness gracious. So anyways, early 70s when Forsyth County schools decided to desegregate, and they started busing kids, they actually did it mid-year. And so parents and teachers and kids got notified over Christmas break that their new school was going to be a different school than what it was before Christmas break. And so teachers that maybe taught in, Clemens or something like that, that were, historically white school basically, they were told that they had to go and teach, that is an urban district or an urban school, maybe in a downtown part of Winston or something like that. And so basically the kids were bused across the county, but then they also had to integrate the teachers. And so you had African-American teachers that had been at historically African-American schools, like, Atkins, and then they were taken and put at, West Forsyth or something like that. And so it was obviously a big time of upheaval in terms of schooling. So it was a solution to a problem, maybe not the best solution because, the kids were on buses for a long time and stuff like that. So it's just kind of the nature of the problem when you have cities that are so segregated just geographically, like Winston-Salem definitely was. It still is to some extent, but it was definitely significantly worse back then. So, all right, let's continue on here. So this was a big Supreme Court case, basically that said that freedom of choice was not going to work. That was not really a solution to desegregating schools because so many of the minority families were in poverty and they just didn't have the opportunity to actually take their kids to a different neighborhood to send them to schools. And so the school districts were compelled to then start busing. And so this was early 1970s. And so a lot of districts in the South then had to then bus kids across counties or across districts to get the numbers balanced, basically. Okay. All right. So next big topic is affirmative action. This is an interesting topic. I've got a Supreme Court case we'll talk about in here. It's not one that you're required to know or anything like that, but it's a good kind of illustrative example of how affirmative action was working or maybe not working, and then maybe kind of shows how it's changed since the initial kind of enactment of it. So beginning of the 1960s, the federal government decided that they needed to put some pressure on the public and private sector to try to balance racial numbers in student populations in colleges. And this was continued on into the private sector, into industry and stuff like that as well. But initially it was designed to try to make sure that colleges were accepting minority students and giving them a fair shot of getting admitted to the schools. And they obviously realized that the schools that a lot of the minorities were coming from were not equal. And there was still, obviously, like we talked about here, some segregation issues that were still prevalent, especially in the South. And so what the colleges had to do is figure out a way to try to make it so that it was more accessible for minority students to get into the colleges. And so that process is called affirmative action. So we're going to focus a lot on collegiate education. We already looked at that UNC case, Supreme Court case from a couple years ago that dealt with UNC and Harvard. But again, like I said, we're going to kind of focus on collegiate education, but this was happening in the private businesses as well. So we're going to start with a little story time here. This is Alan Backey. His story is kind of interesting. This is obviously a long time ago. You can see black and white and the sweet hairdos and sunglasses or glasses and stuff like that. So in any case, I think I might bring back this haircut. What do you think? Should maybe do that. But anyways, Alan Backey is Vietnam era. Okay, so he was in the Marine Corps when he got out of high school. He enlisted in the Marines. And he knew he wanted to be a doc someday, so he volunteered to be like a flight medic. So he was a flight doc So obviously in Vietnam, lots of helicopters and stuff. And so he was in one of the helicopters that would go and pick up wounded soldiers, and he would treat them while they're flying back to a base to get to an actual hospital. So he was doing a lot of like life-saving stuff in flight, kind of like what happened with me on my flight. That there was stuff that had to be done right then, right there to save this person's life, and so he had a lot of experience. And so when he gets out of the war, he takes the MCAT, the Medical College Admissions Test, and he scores a 94 on it, which is like astronomically high. Okay. He was a National Merit Scholar. He was obviously a flight doc in the military for a long time. So he's got like this crazy awesome resume. So he applies to UC Davis, University of California, Davis, which is a pretty competitive school, and he doesn't get in. And he's like, wait a second. And this is right after affirmative action's kind of put in place. And so he's like, this is not right. So he hires an attorney. And the attorney starts doing the investigation, and basically what they find out is that, hold on, I think I've got some stuff here. Yeah, okay, so there we go. So the attorney finds out that UC Davis had a quota, so like a minimum number of minority admissions to the medical school, and it was 16 out of 100. So each year they would admit 100 students, and 16 of them, period, had to be minorities. And so when they did that, they were like, well, okay, so we know that there's got to be a specific number of minority students. And so they did more research, and they found out that there was really not very many minority students, period, that were even applying. And so, you might have 20 or 25 minority students that apply, and so you take the 16 best. Well, what happened was there was a really bad balance of what was going on. So essentially what they found out is that he scored a 94. The average score of the admission for a student in general in UC Davis's med school was a 66, and the average score of the 16 quota minority students was a 33. And so they're like, wait a second, that is like, he's being discriminated against because of his skin color, and it's not like taking the best students. And so they sued. And so the Supreme Court said, okay, so quotas are not okay. You cannot have a set number of students that you're going to admit based upon race. You can still consider race in terms of determining who should and shouldn't get in. And so you can set up like some delineation of requirements for specific races to make it maybe not easier, but like more accessible for minorities to get in. But you can't have like a specific number, okay? And so for a long time, this continued. There was another case that happened with that garbage school up north, and it was a law school. It's actually a really good school, but I hate it because I'm an Ohio State fan. And so there was two white females that sued, saying that they didn't get into law school because of affirmative action. So they were challenging this idea of using race as a factor in admissions. And the Supreme Court said, no, the colleges are allowed to continue this process. And so that continues for a while up until your UNC case that you guys did for homework. And you can see obviously how that's impacted race and admissions, okay? And so we've already talked about this, so I'm gonna go back. So essentially what's happened now is you've kind of got this, you have, like we've talked about so many times with politics, you've got a pendulum. And so you've got, when something gets pulled, really, a pendulum gets pulled really far this way, it's going to naturally swing really far this way. And we've talked about a lot of times that a solution to that is being somewhere in the middle. And you're kind of seeing that happening with this topic, okay? So initially you had affirmative action where there was like racial quotas, and it was really unbalanced in terms of admissions and who was getting in and what their admission scores were and that kind of thing. And that pendulum then has started to swing back now over this way. And so some current events that kind of deal with this is, well, I thought I pulled them up, but I'll put a couple of links up on Canvas for you. There's been, you've probably seen like executive orders that Trump's put into place since he took office, ending DEI programs. And that's just kind of an extension of affirmative action. So this debate over race and accessibility and stuff like that, it's not like it's over. It's not solved. It's not done. It's still being debated heavily. So it's not like it's something that's done and over with. This is something that's still, first and foremost in people's minds and concerned about and things like that. So, okay. So real quick, make sure you watch this video to get your Supreme Court case graphic organizer filled in. There is a FRQ and multiple choice progress check for you on AP Classroom. So take care of it.